Hello, everyone. All right, so looking ahead to next week, let me share my screen with you guys. We will be finishing our readings from Marx. So we'll be interleaving selections from the Grundrisse and from Das Kapital for Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday of next week. So you'll see all these page numbers refer to selections from the Marx-Engels Reader. So Monday we'll get started with a few selections from the Grundrisse, page 221 to 226 and 236 to 244, and then Das Kapital 294 to 312. Let me see who's all here now. Okay. So, any volunteers for presenting on Monday? Anyone who hasn't presented yet? So remember that presenting means submitting notes to the discussion thread and then verbally helping us go through your notes in class.
I could do that.
Okay.
If you don't mind. Yeah.
So Monday, that would be great. Okay, Brett, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can I have a second volunteer for Monday? Elin. Great, thank you. All right, so we've got two for Monday, Brett and Elin. How about Tuesday?
I can do Tuesday.
Next? Okay,
Yep.
great. Could I get a second volunteer for Tuesday? Oh, okay, great. So we have a second volunteer for Tuesday as well. Thank you. And how about Thursday?
For volunteer.
Great. And a second volunteer for Thursday. Anybody? Thursday, the last installation of Marx.
I can do Thursday as well if you don't mind.
Okay, that'll be fine. Cool. All right. Have you presented before, Brett?
No, I haven't presented yet.
Okay, great. Okay, good. All right, great. So we have our volunteers for next week. Thank you, guys. All right, so turning now to the notes from Tuesday for the material that we didn't get through yet. Let me bring up my Marx-Engels Reader. Hold on. Okay, here we are. Let's see. We have yet to get to the 1844 manuscripts. So I wanted to recall for us what we discussed on Tuesday, which was the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena. So we have some indication of that procedure of Marx's already in the two early philosophical writings by Marx that we did cover on Tuesday, to make the world philosophical and for the ruthless criticism of everything existing. But now let's turn to the beginning of the 1844 manuscripts and look at how Marx articulates it here. So he says, this is in the Estranged labor section, we have proceeded from the premises of political economy. We have accepted its language and its laws. We presupposed private property, the separation of labor, capital, and land, and of wages, profit of capital, and rent of land. Likewise, division of labor, competition, the concept of exchange value, etc. On the basis of political economy itself, in its own words, we have shown that the worker sinks to the level of a commodity and becomes indeed the most wretched of commodities, that the wretchedness of the worker is in inverse proportion to the power and magnitude of his production, that the necessary result of competition is the accumulation of capital in a few hands, and thus the restoration of monopoly in a more terrible form, that finally the distinction between capitalist and land rentier, like that between the tiller of the soil and the factory worker, disappears, and that the whole of society must fall apart into the two classes, the property owners and the propertyless workers. Okay, so let's unpack that in terms of the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena. So he is saying that he is working through, in its own terms, so within its own terminology, its own categories, bourgeois political economy. So we've encountered that in the form of Adam Smith. So he's accepting its terms, he's operating fully within its set of concepts and categories. But he is showing how it's become self-contradictory. Self-contradictory both in its manifest phenomena, but also in its tendencies. So this is not something that we emphasized when we were talking about Smith, but now we can return to this. When Smith was critiquing the East India Company, when he was critiquing monopolies, they were government-established monopolies, monopolies on trade especially. But really any monopoly is curbing of the market. Any monopoly is a monopoly on trade. He was using the example of international trade, foreign trade, colonial trade, but really it would apply to anything. And he was seeing it as a result of government policy favoring the mercantile interest. In other words, trying to corner the market, was acting out of the mercantile interest, and he was opposed to it. Adam Smith was very much opposed to it, and he saw it as politically illegitimate, meaning not the way that things would naturally, organically develop, necessarily, through progress in the division of labor and expansion of trade. But it might be a spontaneous result of the people's mercantile interest expressed in the realm of politics. So he talked about, very famous phrase, by the way, Britain, England, as a nation of shopkeepers, by which he means driven by the mercantile interest. And the mercantile interest is to sell dear and buy cheap, meaning you sell things for as much as possible, you charge people as much as possible for what you sell, you try to buy things for as little as possible. So you try to profit as much as possible off the exchange, off the trade, which is very different from profiting in the sense of making labor more productive. So Adam Smith was in favor of the profit motive insofar as it resulted in increased productivity of labor, but if it's just gypping people on the market, then he's against it. What Marx is saying is that industrial capitalism, what happens to bourgeois political economy in the Industrial Revolution, is that it has the opposite results of what it assumed. Meaning it's no longer a government-imposed monopoly, but it's a spontaneous monopoly that comes from the concentration of capital into a few hands. So there's something about capitalism itself that defies the goals and the presumptions of bourgeois political economy. The ideals of bourgeois political economy are violated in industrial capitalism, but not for the reasons that someone like Adam Smith would have thought. It's not happening through government action. It's happening in the laissez-faire economy. It's happening through the action of the free market, but in the era of industrial capital. So again, the assumptions of bourgeois political economy result in the opposite of what they expected in the era of industrial capitalism. So there's a self-contradictory aspect to bourgeois political economy in industrial capitalism. So this is just a kind of initial determination, like he's just noting this. And then he gets into some of the problems regarding how bourgeois political economy understands history, using property as his example. So he says, political economy proceeds from the fact of property, but it does not explain it to us. It expresses in general abstract formula the material processes through which private property actually passes, and these formula it then takes for laws. It does not comprehend these laws, i.e. does not demonstrate how they arise from the very nature of private property. So what we're going to encounter here in the 1844 manuscripts is that the category is property. He will use capital. He's already used the term capital, but he's mostly addressing it through private property. Why? Why is that the appearance that he is using? Why isn't he using capital, especially if he means industrial capitalism? If he doesn't mean private property in general, but this specific kind of private property, namely capital. Because this is a unfinished work by Marx that was meant to be not the imminent dialectical critique of bourgeois political economy, but the imminent dialectical critique of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's book, What is Property? So Proudhon, he's the father of anarchism, is the preeminent socialist of this time, 1844. He's come out as the most prominent. Prior to this, it was utopian socialists. There were other people that he mentions, for instance, in the letter to Ruga for the ruthless criticism of everything existing. But really, Proudhon is the central figure, and Proudhon is Marx's target. So Proudhon had written a book, What is Property? And Marx is critiquing that book. Now, here's another thing that Proudhon is famous for. So he asks the question, what is property? His answer is, property is theft. Property is theft. So very much Rousseau in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, the way Rousseau put it was, the founder of civil society is the person who declares this is mine and gets other people who are stupid enough to believe him. But then Rousseau backs off that and says, but a lot had to have happened historically for this to come to pass. And that's what Marx is saying here. Marx is saying, okay, they proceed from the fact of private property, but they don't really investigate its history. So he's kind of bringing that to Proudhon now. And he's also got a ready response, as we'll see, which is property is not theft, property is labor. And if the workers have been expropriated of their property, it's because their labor has become estranged. Now, this term estranged also means alienated. So he'll use both words. He'll use estranged and he'll use alienated. In German, it's the same. It's the same word in German, but in English translation, they'll switch between estranged and alienated. And the only difference, really, is that alienated is Latin and estranged is more Germanic. So estranged has more of a kind of visceral, emotional feel, and alienated is a little bit more abstract, conceptual. What we'll find is that estranged means a kind of negative alienation, and whereas alienation, that word is more neutral. We encountered the word alienation first of all in Horkheimer, in The Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom, but also in Marx's passage on becoming from the Grundrisse. And then finally we encountered it with Rousseau. And with Rousseau, especially in On the Social Contract, but also in Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, alienation has more of a productive quality, meaning alienation is the process by which society comes into being, humans give up their natural liberties for moral freedom, etc. And the passage on the legislator from On the Social Contract, where Rousseau says, in exchange for their natural faculties, the people get in society alien powers from which that they can exercise only with others. So they lose their independence, they become dependent, they exchange their natural faculties for alien powers that they can only make use of with other people in society. And he calls that moral freedom as opposed to natural liberty. And indeed, natural liberty is not really freedom at all, because natural liberty, one is still subject to physical needs, biological needs, and instincts. So we're dominated by physical, biological nature, and we transform that nature in society. And we do that through a process of alienation. This is very important, because Hegel takes this up. So for Hegel, we've encountered this in the Introduction to the Philosophy of History. Progress in consciousness of freedom takes place through a process where we externalize, objectify, and indeed alienate ourselves, and then reappropriate those externalizations, objectifications, alienations. So it's a process of externalization and reappropriation. We elaborate, we realize the potential within us by externally elaborating it and reappropriating it. So a dialectical conception of alienation, which actually begins with Rousseau. Meaning what we sacrifice, we get back in return something transformed. So Marx is staying very true to that. So why is he bringing Hegel to his critique of Proudhon and Proudhonian anarchism, property is theft, etc.? Well, in fact, because Proudhon, so I'll say this about Marx, Marxism is famously described by Lenin Lenin and then later by Stalin, as having three components. So Marx's own Marxism, Marx and Engels' Marxism has three components, supposedly. The components are British political economy, German philosophy, and French socialism. Really, what we will see is that Marxism is the critique. It's the critique of all three of those things. It's not just the appropriation and synthesis of these things, but in fact it's the critique of these things, in part because Marx sees them all as aspects of the same thing, meaning German philosophy, British political economy, and French socialism all express the same thing, namely the bourgeois emancipation of labor. In philosophical terms, in economic terms, and in political terms. So he critiques all three of those things. And indeed, Proudhon was there before Marx. So Proudhon famously said, he wrote, that he only observed three authorities: Adam Smith, Hegel, and the Bible. He was a Christian socialist. Actually, he was an anti-Semite, but that's another story. Unfortunately, a lot of the socialists were anti-Semites. So, indeed, because they blame capitalism on the Jewish principle. So, all foreshadowing, of course, the Nazis in the 20th century, who did that same thing. So, Proudhon is French socialism, and he was already trying to combine his political perspective, coming out of the French Revolution, with British political economy, Adam Smith, and German philosophy, Hegel. Marx's critique is precisely that Proudhon naively mobilizes Smith, Hegel, and his own assumptions as a French socialist, whereas, in fact, all three of these domains had come into self-contradiction, meaning the legacy of the French Revolution, the radicalism, the political radicalism of the French Revolution had come into self-contradiction. British political economy writ large, had come into self-contradiction, and Hegelian philosophy had come into self-contradiction. So that's how he proceeds to attack Proudhon, if you will. Not attack in the sense of just assailing, but his sort of approach, his critical approach on Proudhon. Now, we also encountered in the letter to Ruge for the ruthless criticism of everything existing. He said, our approach could be religion, it could be science, it could be philosophy, it could be politics, it could be economics, it could be anything. In the political domain, he says there's a debate between the corporate and the representative system. The corporate system is basically the caste system, and the corporations refer to the castes as corporate bodies, but also the guilds. So a political system composed of inputs from the various castes and also from the guilds, or the representative system. And he favors the representative system, Marx. So what Benjamin Constant talked about, representative democracy, and representative democracy with civil liberties, not a corporate system, which is still the medieval system of duties and rights based on caste status or based on corporate status as guild status. He favors the representative system, but he says there, the representative system has come into self-contradiction. So the political system has come into self-contradiction. Now, Proudhon deals with that by being an anarchist. So his phrase, anarchism, the concept of anarchism, the term, it's posed this way. As he was asked, are you a Democrat, small d Democrat? Meaning, do you favor the rule of the people? That's what democracy means, the rule of the people. And he said, no, I'm not a Democrat because I favor the rule of no one. So not the rule of the people, but the rule of no one. That's anarchism. But in doing so, he sidestepped the whole political domain and how the crisis of capitalism was affecting the political domain. And we're going to get into that in the readings that we had for this evening, but also it's something that we will take up henceforth, subsequently. Namely, Marx's concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat and what that's about. It's about how liberal democracy, modern democratic republicanism, modern representative democracy, civil liberty had come into self-contradiction in capitalism in particular. But this is the way he's proceeding with Proudhon. He's proceeding through the imminent dialectical critique, not of bourgeois political economy, but of a specific criticism of bourgeois political economy, and that's Proudhon. The other reading that we had for this evening, for Thursday, on the coming upheaval, is taken from the book that Marx wrote that he did publish. So this is unpublished notes to a book that we're reading in the 1844 manuscripts, but later in 1847, he did write and publish a book, his critique of Proudhon. His critique of Proudhon that he did publish, that we had that excerpt from in The Coming Upheaval, is called The Poverty of Philosophy. It could also be translated The Misery of Philosophy. The book that he criticized by Proudhon was called The Philosophy of Misery, or The Philosophy of Poverty. It's usually translated as The Philosophy of Misery. So Marx did this kind of inversion of the title, The Misery of Philosophy, or The Poverty of Philosophy. That was the critique of Proudhon that he did write completely and finish and publish. But that book is more directly about the details of how Proudhon understands capitalism. Here it's a little bit more abstract. So if property is not theft, but property is labor, then he is sharing the assumption. He is agreeing with John Locke, who said that property is not an usurpation, it's not a theft, it's not a physical possession taken by force, but property is a social right. It's not a physical possession, but a social right earned or recognized by labor. However, private property in the form of capital, which is perhaps different than in the form of rent, private property in the form of capital as based on labor, but estranged labor, self-estranged labor. All right, let me mention something about this, which is if property results from labor, if labor establishes property rights in the John Locke sense, and his version of it had as its paradigm land. So the land belongs to the farmer, not to the feudal lord. The feudal lord has it by virtue of conquest. The farmer has it, the peasant has it by virtue of working the land and improving the land. So therefore, he's mixed his labor in it. So John Locke said anything that someone could be said to have mixed his labor in belongs to him as his property. So again, this is very near and dear to Hegel. What does it mean to mix your labor in something? It means to externalize yourself through your labor. So property is a self-externalization, a self-objectification, a self-alienation, but it's the externalization and objectification through which we recognize our productive activity, and it belongs to us. It's an extension of us. It's an extension of us into the world that can be recognized by others. And so it's a social relation. Property is a social relation. So here's really the point. The two results of labor, which he gets to at the bottom of page 71. Right, so labor produces two things. It produces an article of consumption. It produces a commodity in the sense of a use value, and also an exchange value. That's what we're familiar with. Labor produces things, or it produces services, or it produces intellectual goods. It doesn't have to be physical things. Articles of consumption, things that are useful to someone else. It also, however, produces a social relation. And this goes back to Rousseau. Rousseau, on the social contract, the general will, as opposed to the particular will. So the particular will of someone making something, producing something to be sold on the market. The particular will acting out of self-interest, appealing to others not through their charity, but through their self-interest, making something that someone else needs and wants, making a use value for someone else to consume, and doing it out of your self-interest. So doing it out of their self-interest and doing it out of your self-interest. That transaction, that contract, the transaction that contracts people to each other in an exchange relation, is not just the fulfillment of the particular wills of the participants, not just the fulfillment of the buyer and the seller, their wills as particular wills, but there's a general will that encompasses and transcends them both. The contract itself has a will of its own. How is that? Because the exchange has an effect beyond satisfying the self-interest of the exchanging parties, meaning it develops production itself. So in Adam Smith's view, exchange relations, trade, commerce, improves production because it encourages specialization. It encourages the division of labor, which increases productivity without anyone intending that be the case. So people trade without intending to increase productivity in general, and yet it has that effect. That's what Marx is talking about here, because that second result of production, namely increased productivity, belongs not to the workers as it did for Adam Smith. For Adam Smith, it increases their standard of living. It increases their subsistence level. It increases the necessaries and conveniences of life available to everyone. Instead, for Marx, in industrial capitalism, in machine production, that increased production doesn't belong to the workers, it ends up belonging to the capitalist. In what way? In the form of capital, in the form of alienated labor, estranged labor, in the form of capital. And that manifests as what we refer to, and what they referred to back then, as capital goods, technology, machines, trade secrets, ways of organizing production, right? So what does a capitalist own? When they invest their money in a company, what do they own? They own its intellectual property, they own its trade secrets, they own its machines, its technology. That's what you buy. When Elon Musk bought Twitter, what did he buy? He bought a huge number of labor contracts for the employees of Twitter, but he also bought its intellectual property. He bought its brand, but he bought its user base for sure, but really what did he buy? Its algorithms. Right? And yet, those algorithms were produced by programmers. It no longer belonged to them, it belonged to the owner of the capital invested in the company. So it's a very complex process by which labor becomes self-alienated. Improvement in production becomes estranged from and contradictory to the interests of the workers. So he says, the worker becomes all the poorer the more wealth he produces, the more his production increases in power and range. The worker becomes an ever cheaper commodity, the more commodities he creates. With the increasing value of the world of things proceeds in direct proportion the devaluation of the world of men. Labor produces not only commodities, it produces itself, and the worker as a commodity, so the worker's means of subsistence, and does so in the proportion to which it produces commodities generally. This fact expresses merely that the object which labor produces, labor's product, confronts it as something alien, as a power independent of the producer. So that's not referring to the article of consumption. That's referring to capital. The product of labor is labor which has been congealed in an object which has become material. It is the objectification of labor. Labor's realization is its objectification. In the conditions dealt with by political economy, this realization of labor appears as the loss of reality for the workers, objectification as loss of its object, and object bondage, appropriation as estrangement, as alienation. Because after all, how do the workers get their means of subsistence? Through trade, through exchange. They pay for commodities with their wages, and in so doing, they are actually contributing to the alienation of other workers' production. They're contributing to the capitalization of other people's labor by the capitalists. So he says, so much does labor's realization appear as the loss of reality that the worker loses reality to the point of starving to death. Now, what is he talking about? What the hell is that? Well, that's, of course, the result of the Industrial Revolution, where workers have been thrown out of work by technology. So much does objectification appear as loss of the object that the worker is robbed of the objects most necessary not only for the life, but for his work. Indeed, labor itself becomes an object which he can get hold of only with the greater effort and with the most irregular interruptions. So much does the appropriation of the object appear as estrangement that the more objects the worker produces, the fewer can he possess, and the more he falls under the dominion of his product, capital. So the worker's not dominated by the article of consumption that's produced, but by capital that's produced. And capital is estranged labor. It's alienated labor. It's alienated labor in terms of an alienated or estranged social relation itself. All right, let me turn now to your notes. Okay, so we could Grace, did you want to address your notes on the 1844 manuscripts?
Yeah, I can do that. So my first note is workers sink to the level of commodity in which they sink to the level of being a commodity in the view of the people that owns the business. So they basically become tools for money in their view, and they end up lacking the proper rights, which leads to a lot of different issues that are difficult to solve without union representation or proper workplace protection laws. A quote I took from the reading: the only wheels which political economy sets in motion are avarice and the war amongst the avaricious, so competition. Avarice means greedy, so he's saying that political economy is fueled by greed and the competition between greedy people, and that's very reflective of today's current political climate with all the manipulation of markets and tax cuts by the current president. The objectification of labor is pretty much the more a worker performs that said labor, the deeper and poorer they fall into it. It makes them lose their sense of reality, and it essentially forces the labor of the object to become the sole reason for their existence. This leads to workplace culture, mentality of working all day, every day, and even off the clock, which is something that is still commonly seen today. The reading also mentions alienation of labor, where labor alienates the person from life in general, and their work essentially becomes something that is no longer done out of free will or satisfaction. The universality of man is in practice manifested precisely in the universality which makes all nature his inorganic body. So I was kind of confused by this quote. I wasn't sure if he's saying that the man's body is the only thing that's organic, or I just don't understand what he means by inorganic.
Right, so it has to do with how nature is rendered. We might say how nature is rendered artificial because of the particular way that we interact with nature. So this gets to our point of alienation that I wanted to talk about, because he talks about the 4 kinds of alienation. He says that capitalism results in alienation from others, alienation from nature, alienation from oneself, and alienation from the product of labor, which is really alienation from one's own activity in labor. So organic body, inorganic body. Inorganic would mean alienated. So nature becomes the inorganic body, meaning nature becomes a mere resource for labor, which is a very specific way of interacting with nature. So if you recall our social relations, we've dealt with this chart of terms in terms of social relations. Social relations are not just relations between people, but also relations with nature and relations with ourselves. So how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to nature, how we relate to other people in bourgeois society is through labor and through production. So others become collaborators, they become people that we're cooperating with, including through competition. I'll come back to competition in a minute. Nature becomes an object that we work on. It becomes the raw material for our labor, which is a very specific and in some ways impoverished way of relating to nature. And our relation to ourselves is as laborers. So we relate to ourselves as producers. We seek to be productive to maximize the value of our time, to be as efficient as possible, and to attain to a kind of condition of health that's based on laboring capacity. So in terms of like physical health or mental health, the severity of illness will be measured on the basis of, does it prevent you from working? Are you suffering from physical ailment so severe that you can't work? Are you suffering from a mental ailment that's so severe it prevents you from work? That's the measure of health. If you're healthy enough to work. So, on the question of, let's see, where you were coming into this. Greed. Okay, so if you recall, we talked about this, that an important thinker for Rousseau, and also for Adam Smith, and for Kant and Hegel, we have a phrase from Kant, unsocial sociability. Everyone acting out of self-interest, but producing more than the sum of its parts in the Rousseauian general will. Where does this come from? It comes from Bernard Mandeville, The Fable of the Bees, where the key idea there is that private vice leads to public benefit. Private vice is a public virtue. So what is a vice in terms of people's private lives, meaning greed, is actually beneficial to the public and is a virtue to the public. So you mention, the kind of frank capitalism of the Republican Party and the Trump administration. Their policies are all about capitalism, capitalism, capitalism. So how do they define capitalism? They define capitalism largely in the same terms that most socialists and communists define capitalism. We'll see that Marx defines it differently. They define it as profit motive, market competition, greed is good. The Oliver Stone movie Wall Street, with the main character played by Michael Douglas, famously uttering this phrase, greed is good. Trying to capture the ethos of the 1980s, which was the era of Republican governance under Ronald Reagan. And Trump seems to be, in some ways, a return to that. So greed is good. Well, no, greed is vice. Greed is avarice. It's a sin, isn't it? Well, no. It has this public benefit. So what you have with the Republicans is what Marxists used to call bourgeois ideology, meaning the idea that capitalism is still bourgeois society, that this kind of Bernard Mandeville and also John Locke, labor, is the means by which we appropriate property. Fable of the Bees, Bernard Mandeville, private vice leads to public benefit. Private vice is actually a public virtue. And Adam Smith, we should appeal to others out of their self-interest, not out of charity, and we should ourselves act out of self-interest, and everything will be guided to a beneficial future by the invisible hand. Not necessarily of the market, by the way, so it's usually misconstrued. It's not the invisible hand of the market. It's the invisible hand of society, the general will of society in Rousseauian terms. Marx's point is that, in fact, no, it just is really a sin. It really is a vice in capitalism. So where do we get avarice as a sin? Where do we get greed as a vice from? From religion. Religion classifies greed, avarice as a sin. Bourgeois society says, in fact, it's a virtue. In capitalism, it returns to being a vice, but not in the sense of a religious sin, because after all, we're condemned to sin since we were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Since we were kicked out of paradise, we're condemned to be sinners, according to Christian theology. No, greed is a different thing under capitalism. Why? Because it doesn't work out in the bourgeois way, because it doesn't lead to a public benefit, because it doesn't lead to a public virtue. What does that mean? It doesn't lead to the increased standard of living, to the rise in the level of subsistence, to the benefit of the workers. In the bourgeois view, in the Rousseau view of the general will, in the Bernard Mandeville view of private vice leading to public benefit, in the Adam Smith view, competition is actually a form of cooperation, since the result of competition is to improve production. So people might go out of business, there might be market corrections, but there isn't really a destruction of production. There isn't a destruction of productivity in the way that there is in capitalism. And that's really what Marx is trying to get at. Again, it's the 1840s, it's the Hungry 40s, it's the period of the first global depression, the first commercial crisis after the Industrial Revolution. It's leading to mass unemployment, to the shuttering, the closing of factories. It's leading to the destruction of production. It is having an effect far beyond a market correction or a change spurred by competition. Okay, so when I say is not, or was and is no longer, when I use those kinds of phrases, we have to be careful. In fact, we still live in bourgeois society according to Marx, meaning competition still is a form of cooperation. Private vice does lead to public benefit. It does. It is ultimately a virtue in light of the public. Bourgeois society in the Adam Smith sense is still the case. However, it's contradicted. Meaning both things are going on at the same time. The John Locke view, property is based on labor. The Bernard Mandeville view, private vice leads to public benefit and virtue. Rousseau's view, the general will more than the sum of its parts. Smith's view about division of labor, increasing production, spurred by market exchange and commercial activity. Kant's view, unsocial sociability, that we're rendered social by our unsocial inclinations. All of that is still the case, but it's also contradicted by industrial capitalism. So we have to be careful about this. Meaning we have two things working simultaneously in contradiction. We're going to see that Marx defines capitalism as the contradiction of bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production. We will also see from the Communist Manifesto that we read for this evening that Marx and Engels, what they expected in the 1840s didn't happen. What they expected was that the Industrial Revolution led from bourgeois society to communism. Meaning industrial production led directly to communism. That didn't happen, that has not been the case. Meaning we've had 200 years of industrial capitalism. He did not expect that to be the case. He expected the revolution of 1848 that he saw coming on the horizon to lead directly into communism. That didn't happen. And then he had to rethink. We'll see how he rethought his political strategy for how capitalism might lead to communism. But he really did think industrial production led to communism. It led beyond bourgeois society to communism. It turns out it's more complicated than that, especially at a political level. So there isn't that linear path that once you introduce machine production, then you have communism as the result. No. That hasn't happened. So that changes things. Meaning for Marx to say, oh, it's become the reverse, it's contradicted the bourgeois expectations, especially the language he uses. Less in the readings we've done this week. Some of the language he uses next week in the readings from the Grundrisse and Das Kapital will lead you to think that what Marx is talking about is the hypocrisy of capitalism, the venality of capitalism, the corruption and depravity of capitalism, all of which is of course true. There is depravity, there is corruption, there is hypocrisy. But that's not really the point. The point is that it's contradiction, which is different. Contradiction doesn't just mean hypocrisy. It does not. It doesn't mean corruption. It doesn't mean a debasement or a depravity. It means actually contradiction. And we'll see. We're going to get into more of that next week, how this works, how the contradiction of capitalism keeps capitalism going. At this stage in his career in the 1840s, he expects the contradiction of industrial production to lead directly into communism. And that's why he's describing things the way he does here. All right. Cato, would you like to take us through your notes on the 1844 manuscripts?
Sure, yeah. I just wrote down a lot of key points which I thought were kind of thought-provoking. We've gone over a lot of the concepts, so I'll go over some things that I thought were interesting. I saw that he made a lot of repeated references to religion for his arguments in a way that, like, at least at first glance, seemed to be very towards the atheistic side. And I thought that was interesting to do in in kind of a political essay at a time where religion was still so hot, like upheld in high society.
Yep.
Um, I'm not sure if he got any. I'm sure he got criticism for it, but
Absolutely.
I'm interested to hear how people read that. And then I also found kind of a lot of concepts rooted in ideas going back to like Descartes, which feels appropriate given the themes of like introspection. Though with Marx, this introspection seemed to be more societal and like tangible, where Descartes was more like internal, personal, and philosophical.
Yes. That's right. Let me say something about that, because we encountered this a little bit with Kant. I mean, we only dipped our toes in Kant. We didn't get too deep into Kant. But Kant does follow from Descartes. However, he also tries to explain Descartes, meaning what is that inner realm? Where does that inner realm come from? So for Descartes, it is more of a theological proposition. It is more like a rational faculty that's the divine spark given to us by God. It's a divine creation within us, our rationality, our inner realm. For Kant, however, it is the product of society. In other words, it's as members of society that we have that inner realm of rational reflection that Descartes referred to. Right, so already there's a shift, well underway with Rousseau, with Kant, with Hegel, leading up to Marx's time, of saying this inner realm that traditional theology or philosophy, also metaphysics, attributed to a kind of divine spark, a divine creation within us, is actually the product of society. It's the product of our social relations. It's the product of alienation, in fact. But then there's the question of alienation, and that's where Hegel comes back in, by the way. So Hegel understood religion as the first form of freedom, first form of consciousness of freedom, first appearance of freedom, also the first alienation. Meaning Hegel's the one who said that people attributed their freedom to the gods. Meaning what was the product of their own freedom, they attributed to the activity of the gods. That's Hegel. So of course Marx is also agreeing with that, taking that forward. What he does here, again, Proudhon, as a Christian socialist, as a Hegelian, does that mean he's an atheist? Maybe, maybe not necessarily. He's got a Christian ethos, a Christian morals, a Christian ethics, we might say. But Marx is really pursuing that in a way more deeply than he thinks Proudhon did. Meaning, Proudhon still has a kind of Christian moral criticism of capitalism, a Christian moral criticism of bourgeois political economy. And what Marx wants to say is that even that moral criticism is itself a product of alienation. So a Christian critique of capitalism would still be capitalist alienation. It would be the alienated response to an alienated situation. Now, by the way, that's just a first determination. It's one of the reasons why he has religion going through the text, because the phrase that I called attention to when we looked at the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena on Tuesday, all critique begins with the critique of religion. So what's meant by that? All critique is an attempt to see the appearances as alienated appearances, but as containing a possibility beyond themselves. So all critique is the critique of religion, or begins with the critique of religion, because religion is the first form of alienation, and the critique of alienated appearances is not just a critique of alienation as such, but rather an exploration of how alienation points beyond itself. So we know historically, at least from Marx's view, from Hegel's view, that ancient religion, traditional religion, pointed beyond itself. There were revolutions within religion. So the pagan world of classical antiquity was replaced by the Christian world, and the Christian world was revolutionized through the Protestant Reformation. And then the Protestant Reformation gave us the atheistic, secular, bourgeois world of modern society and of the 1700s Enlightenment, which was very anti-religion, anti-theology. So Marx is bringing that forward and saying, okay, well, how does this now play out in capitalism? What's the moral basis for the critique of capitalism, or for really the criticism and the opposition to capitalism? So this is all setting up something that we'll get to with the Communist Manifesto, which is the critique of ideology. So religion as ideology, bourgeois political economy as ideology, bourgeois philosophy as ideology, bourgeois politics, meaning radical democratic revolutionary politics like the French Revolution and the American Revolution, bourgeois ideology. What does ideology mean in this instance? It's the necessary form of appearance. Meaning it's ideology, but not in the sense of like just a systematic political belief system that's false or wrong, or that's tendentious, that's kind of interested, self-interested. But rather, no, this is the way things necessarily appear. Meaning ideology is true. It's false consciousness, but in this peculiar way that Hegel uses the term false consciousness, which is to say that false consciousness is true consciousness. What does that mean? It means it's self-contradictory consciousness, meaning it's only false insofar as it doesn't recognize its own inner contradiction that points beyond itself. So it's on analogy. He's analogizing religion and bourgeois political economy and socialist ideology. He's analogizing these things. Next week we will read his analogy in Das Kapital, commodity fetishism. Commodity fetishism. Because what he means by fetish is not a psychological fetish. It's an anthropological fetish, meaning it refers to fetish as a religious phenomenon. Kind of totemism, the totemic species of ancient peoples. So it's commodity fetishism means the religion that we're still in. That's what bourgeois ideology is for Marx. It's the religion that we're still in. Meaning social relations of labor in industrial capitalism are like a religion. They're a whole moral universe, a whole moral cosmology governing the values of all of our activity and our interaction with others, with nature, and with ourselves. We practice bourgeois social relations like ancient peoples practiced religion. So I hope that helps in terms of the religious references to explain. Okay, go ahead. I don't know if you wanted to get into that stuff about communism and atheism.
I don't really know what to say about it.
Okay. So let's talk about it in terms of what you put in the notes, which is that atheism is communism in one respect, but in another respect, it's just an abstraction. Okay, so what's meant by that? And this is something I'm not sure. Let me see if anyone else put up notes to the 1844 manuscripts. Okay, so you guys didn't address this. So atheism is like a call to abolish religion, right? It's a disbelief in God. But really what it is it's a call to abolish religion. Now, he analogizes that with the socialist or communist demand in the realm of political economy, and specifically like Proudhon's demand. If Proudhon says property is theft, then of course you want to get rid of theft. How do you get rid of theft? You abolish private property. So it looks like atheism is communism in the sense that atheism seeks to abolish God, abolish religion, abolish God's control over us, and in that way it's like the socialist or communist demand to abolish private property. And to abolish specifically private property and capital. So is capital in the same place as God? Meaning if God was a function of human self-alienation in religion, then capital would be a function of human self-alienation in industrial production in bourgeois society. But it's an abstraction. What does that mean? That's a Hegelian term, meaning it's an abstract negation. So the atheism of communism and the demand by communists to abolish private property is actually an abstract negation. It's not a true overcoming. It's an abstract negation. So to want to abolish capitalism, to abolish capitalist private property in the name of the human is only an abstract negation. Whereas what's needed is a true overcoming, a true reappropriation, a true disalienation, which is not accomplished, at least not according to Hegel, through abstract negation. So why would Marx, why is Marx so keen to mobilize Hegel? Because Proudhon claims to be Hegelian. In other words, it's part of the immanent critique. It's not that Marx is uncritical of Hegel. He actually is critical of Hegel. Nonetheless, in this instance, because Proudhon is an avowed Hegelian, he's going to say, well, in fact, Proudhon is a self-contradictory Hegelian in calling to abolish private property. There's an important passage here that I want to address before we take a break, and that is when Marx analogizes the socialist or communist demand to abolish private property with the socialist and communist demand to abolish the family. So where does that come from? All right, so starting with the American and French revolutions, and indeed before that in the bourgeois revolution, but really as a function of the Enlightenment and in the late 1700s in the American and French revolutions, is born a demand for women's equality. Women's equality, the demand for women's equality, especially legal equality, political equality, equal legal rights, equal political rights. That demand is taken up, is mobilized by the socialist and communist movement. So it's born in the bourgeois revolution, taken up by the socialist and communist movement in the 1800s. And the way that the socialist and communist movement in the 1800s took it up is women are oppressed by the family. The patriarchal bourgeois family, the nuclear family. Woman is the property of her husband. So women's equality demands abolition of the family. Marx criticizes this as a self-contradictory demand. He critiques it as a self-contradictory demand. He says to abolish the family would be like abolishing private property. So if you abolish private property, this is a very important passage in the manuscripts. If you abolish private property, then you make everything and everyone the property of the state. If you abolish the family, you make women the common property of society. So you substitute private prostitution for universal public prostitution. So universal public prostitution of women will be the result of abolition of the family. And moreover, and this is something he comes back to in the Communist Manifesto, he says capitalism is already doing this. Capitalism is already doing this. In other words, capitalism is liberating women from the traditional place in the family, but only to prostitute them as workers. And indeed, the analogy is that men who are workers in capitalism are also being prostituted. I think that I mentioned that manufacturing, textile industry, and then industrial production, factory labor, is rejected by men as feminine. So the idea is that factory labor is really fit only for women and children. It's not fit for men. It's not appropriate for men to do that kind of work. It's only fit for women and children. Now, of course, that changes. However, that's the initial. So in fact, women were always there very centrally in the transformation of labor in the Industrial Revolution at a concrete level. So again, he's critiquing, we're going to get into this more explicitly now with the Communist Manifesto, the reading for this evening, but the 1844 Manuscripts is important because it's the imminent dialectical critique of socialism. It's the imminent dialectical critique of communism. It's the imminent dialectical critique of Proudhon. Proudhonian anarchism, which is a kind of socialism. It's a kind of communism, as he mentioned in the letter to Ruga for the ruthless criticism of everything existing. And these demands to abolish private property, to abolish the family, aren't wrong, but they're one-sided and they're abstract. They're abstract negations. They're one-sided. That's the language he used in the letter to Ruga. Here he's using the abstract negation, or abstract abolition. So atheism is the abstract abolition of religion that doesn't actually overcome it. Because after all, if modern bourgeois society, especially in industrial capitalism, is secular, meaning not celestial, not ruled by eternal principles of religion, secular, and moreover atheistic, if it has abolished religion in a practical sense, that has not been the true overcoming of religion. Because religion gets its revenge in the form of capitalism. Still alienated social relations, but not alienated social relations of traditional civilization and religion, but the alienated social relations of bourgeois society in capitalism. All right, let's take a short break, and then we'll come back and talk about another couple of things in the manuscripts, and then get into the readings that we had for tonight. Okay, let's resume. So I want to make mention of a couple of things from the manuscripts before we move on to the reading for tonight. Only because it's of interest to us as people at the Art Institute. So he talks about, as part of his discussion of the meaning of human requirements, he really retreads there a lot that we've encountered from Rousseau in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, and also in On the Social Contract, which is the transformation of human faculties in society across history. He addresses it particularly as the education of the senses. So he talks about the difference between kind of sense data perception of the world and art. So we develop our vision through art, through painting. We develop our hearing through sound, music. etc. So our faculties don't remain the same, so there isn't a static view of human requirements, of human needs. Human needs and human requirements change across history. We develop new needs, we develop new requirements, new necessities that are a function of society that we wouldn't have as animal creatures. So we need art, the way Marx puts it. We need art. We've created a new need for ourselves. Animals don't need art, but human beings do. It's a need that exists as a function of society. Society has created a new need, art, and that's a real need now for us. It's an artificial need in the sense that we've created it, but it's also become a real need of our second nature, which we can't undo. Why is he taking that up? Because he thinks that Proudhon and other socialists and communists have accepted sort of naively and uncritically a phenomenon that he's going to address in the readings from the Grundrisse and Das Kapital next week of utilitarianism. Meaning, there's a utilitarian maxim, it's from Jeremy Bentham, it's the happiness principle, and that is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. That's generally, the ethos by which we live in this society. Greatest good for the greatest number of people. So we're willing to accept a certain number of people getting sick or even dying from vaccines because it will save more lives than it will cost. So the greatest good for the greatest number of people, the happiness principle. The problem is, what do we mean by the good? So the greatest good for the greatest number of people, but how do we define the good? And is the good defined once and for all, or is it a changing thing historically? And of course, it is the latter. It's something that changes historically. And this is something that Rousseau was clear on, Adam Smith was clear on, Kant was clear about this, and Hegel was clear about this. But often the socialists and the communists, before Marx, and in Marx's time, share the kind of bourgeois utilitarianism with which people are trying to grapple with the effects of capitalism. So the effects of industrial capitalism raise the question of what are human requirements? Meaning, workers are being paid the minimum, and we'll get into the reasons why for this next week. They're being paid the minimum to reproduce their labor. Meaning, in the early 1800s, in a way that was not the case prior to this, it was not the case in the 1700s. In the early 1800s, suddenly there's this idea, what's the minimum number of calories a human being needs to consume every day to survive? So they're asking questions about the bare minimum of human needs. Marx sees that as driven by capitalism, that there's something to the logic of industrial production that drives down workers to a bare, like the barest minimum subsistence level, which actually poses the question of what is that? What is the barest subsistence level? What are the basic human needs? And he flips it around and says, well, of course, in a way that's very consonant with Kant and Hegel, indeed the most fundamental need of humans is freedom. So what does that mean? Because that sounds very sentimental, like, yes, freedom, rah, rah, freedom. No. The most fundamental human necessity is that we change our necessity, that we are free to alter the way we meet our subsistence needs, the way we meet our physical, biological needs and our instinctual needs, that we transform the way we meet those needs, and we indeed transform those needs themselves in society across history. So, really posing the question of capitalism not as a question of material misery, but of freedom. So the material deprivation of capitalism, the material misery of capitalism, is secondary to the primary problem of capitalism, which is freedom. Namely, that the way capitalism produces and satisfies new needs is constrained and distorted and impoverished in capitalism. That's really the point. Okay, so let's see where he goes with this. Let's talk about the Communist Manifesto first, and then we'll look at the coming upheaval and class struggle and mode of production. So the coming upheaval is actually predates. Actually, maybe we'll just move chronologically. We'll look at the class struggle and mode of production after the manifesto. Let's look at the coming upheaval from 1847, taken from Marx's Critique of Proudhon, The Poverty of Philosophy, chronologically before the Communist Manifesto. Let me pull that up, and also switch to the notes that you guys posted for this evening. Share my screen with you guys, and we'll look at the coming upheaval. Okay. So this is the end of Proudhon's, the Critique of Proudhon by Marx, Poverty of Philosophy. This is going to get at the issue of class. So Marx wrote, economic conditions first transformed the mass of the people of the country into workers. So they start out as peasants in the Neolithic, post-Neolithic revolution era of traditional civilization, subsistence agricultural civilization. In the bourgeois era, the mass of people went from being peasants in a subsistence economy of agriculture into workers. The combination of capital has created for this mass a common situation and common interests. This mass is thus already a class as against capital, but not yet for itself. In the struggle, of which we have noted only a few phases, this mass becomes united and constitutes itself as a class for itself. The interests it defends become class interests, but the struggle of class against class is a political struggle. An oppressed class is the vital condition for every society founded on the antagonism of classes. The emancipation of the oppressed class thus implies necessarily the creation of a new society. For the oppressed class to be able to emancipate itself, it is necessary that the productive powers already acquired and the existing social relations should no longer be capable of existing side by side. Of all the instruments of production, the greatest productive power is the revolutionary class itself. The organization of revolutionary elements as a class supposes the existence of all the productive forces which could be engendered in the bosom of the old society. Does this mean that after the fall of the old society there will be a new class domination culminating in a new political power? No. The condition for the emancipation of the working class is the abolition of every class, just as the condition for the liberation of the third estate, of the bourgeois order, was the abolition of all estates and all orders, meaning the abolition of caste was required for bourgeois society to come into existence. Now the question is the abolition of class. The working class, in the course of its development, will substitute for the old civil society an association, which will exclude classes and their antagonism, and there will be no more political power properly so called, since political power is precisely the official expression of antagonism in civil society. Meanwhile, the antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie is a struggle of class against class, a struggle which, carried to its highest expression, is a total revolution. Indeed, is it at all surprising that a society founded on the opposition of classes should culminate in brutal contradiction, the shock of body against body as its final denouement. Do not say that social movement excludes political movement. There is never a political movement which is not at the same time social. It is only in an order of things in which there are no more classes and class antagonisms that social evolutions will cease to be political revolutions. Till then, on the eve of every general reshuffling of society, the last word of social existence will always be combat or death, bloody struggle or extinction. It is thus that the question is inexorably put. And that last bit is a quotation from a Georges Sand novel. Okay, let's unpack that a little bit. So why does he say, do not say that social movement excludes political movement? Well, again, this is another critique of Proudhon that he's mounting here. And Proudhon, as an anarchist, and subsequent anarchists after Proudhon, rejected the political struggle and the political movement and took up the social movement and the social struggle exclusively. Why is that? Because for anarchists, the state itself is the problem. And so you don't want to engage in a political movement or a political struggle, because then you'll end up taking over the state and you'll establish a new ruling class. Namely, that the state is the source of class antagonisms. The state is the thing that establishes the political and social order. And therefore, if you try to capture the state, you're just going to create a new hierarchy. That's the anarchist position. What Marx is saying is, well, no. In this case, in the struggle of the working class, in the struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, it is not trying to set itself up as a new ruling class. The working class is not trying to set itself up as a new ruling class. So why is that? Well, because it's not a function of the state, it's a function of civil society. And the antagonism in civil society comes from social contradiction. And social contradiction, as we were just reading in the 1844 manuscripts, comes from self-alienation. Meaning, if capital is alienated labor, then the capitalists are not the cause, but the effect of alienated labor. So, now what he says about class is important here. It's a little bit dense and needs unpacking. It's a little opaque and needs clarification. So he's saying objectively, capitalism produces this class division and produces the working class as a class in itself. But what's necessary is for the working class to not just be objectively determined, but subjectively determined. It has to become a class for itself. But in becoming a class for itself, it's actually trying to abolish itself. This is another Hegelianism. This is another Hegelian dialectical proposition, which is that something only becomes something in itself when it becomes something for itself, and it only becomes something for itself in the process of abolishing itself. We'll see what he says about this in the Manifesto, about communism being the real movement of history and the proletariat being the embodiment of the negative principle of capitalism. Meaning, for Marx, the proletariat is the product of capitalism, in which capitalism is abolishing itself, in which capitalism is both realizing itself and abolishing itself, and the proletariat is the phenomenon of that. Looked at another way in the 1844 manuscripts, alienated labor is a phenomenon of how capitalism is realizing itself as a function of it abolishing itself. Now again, that's his view that industrial capitalism is leading directly to communism. That's the view that he had in the late 1840s, and around the eve, the right preceding the 1848 revolutions that break out. So I mentioned let me go to the Manifesto. I mentioned the Hungry 40s, the historical context. So the 1840s, the Hungry 40s. By the end of the 1840s, there's a general set of demands that are arising. There's a kind of fomentation in society leading to a political crisis. So what are the demands that are being made in this crisis of the 1840s? In France, which is a important example for Marx, the French Revolution had been politically overthrown, and you had the restoration of the monarchy in 1814, and then again in 1815 after the second defeat of Napoleon. That's the Bourbon restoration. So that's the restoration of the Bourbon royal family from before the French Revolution. So the family of Louis XVI. Also the family of Louis XIV of Versailles. So the Bourbon dynasty is restored. In 1830, there's a revolution. That's the July Revolution. It overthrows the Bourbon and establishes in the place of the absolute monarchy, so they restored the absolute monarchy, they install a constitutional monarchy. So in some ways, in 1830, they achieve what they set out to achieve in 1789. Because actually in 1789, the French Revolution did not aspire to have a democratic republic, but aspired to have what the English had, a constitutional monarchy. But Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette didn't go along with it. They conspired against the revolution, and so they were tried and executed for betraying the revolution. So they got a democratic republic instead of a constitutional monarchy. In 1830, the overthrow of the Restoration monarchy brings about the constitutional monarchy, and how is that done? They bring in the junior branch or cadet branch of the royal family. So the brother of Louis XIV, who established absolutism in the French case, in the French monarchy in France. His brother, the Duke of Orleans, that was his title, that junior side of the family, they were the only people to support the trying and execution of Louis XVI in the French Revolution. So the Duke of Orleans in 1789, 1791, 92, approves of, yes, he's betrayed the revolution. So they bring in the Orleans family. So they bring in Louis Philippe Orleans, or the Orleans monarchy, constitutional monarchy. And Louis Philippe Orleans is called the bourgeois king, the citizen king, also the regicide king. The regicide kings, meaning symbolically it's important that they install as constitutional monarch the dynasty from the side of the family that approved of the French Revolution, that approved of the trying and execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Also in the flag. So the French Revolutionary flag is the tricolor. That was gotten rid of in place of the white flag of the Bourbon in the Restoration monarchy, but they bring back the tricolor flag of the French Revolution in the Orleans constitutional monarchy, in the July Revolution and what's known as the July Monarchy. The July Monarchy is in trouble in the 1840s because of the worldwide Great Depression of the 1840s, because of the commercial and financial collapse. And the idea is that they might have gotten rid of the old caste system, the rule of the aristocracy and the church, but instead it was replaced by the plutocracy, is what they called it, the rule of money. The rule of money. That the July Monarchy had brought about not the rule of the people, but the rule of money. So they want to restore the democratic republic from the French Revolution. They want the rule of the people, not the rule of money. They also want not just a democratic republic, but they want a social republic. So what's meant by a social republic? They want social democracy. They want a social democratic republic. What does that mean? It means they want a democratic republic that can address the social question. So what is the social question of the 1840s? The proletariat. The social question is the condition affecting the proletarianized working class in the industrial era. I mentioned that Engels had written a book. He was shocked when he went to Manchester in England and he saw the condition of the industrial working class. He wrote a whole book called The Condition of the Working Class in England, about the appalling conditions brought about by industrial labor, the proletarianization of labor, the driving down of subsistence levels to their bare minimum. So the social republic was meant to address this. And this is the agitation, these are the demands that are in the air leading up to the 1848 revolution that breaks out. Now, the 1848 revolutions, they're called the Spring of the Peoples or the Spring of the Nations, and it's where we get the term spring from, like the Arab Spring. Or in 1968, there was the Prague Spring, a kind of liberal thawing of Stalinist communism in Czechoslovakia. So this term, the Spring, comes from the 1848 revolutions, which are largely forgotten now, in part because they failed. So the key revolutions that took place that Marx and Engels participated in and wrote about were the 1848 revolutions in France and Germany. So there was a French Revolution in 1848, there's a German Revolution in 1848 that continues into 1849, that Marx and Engels directly participate in. What do they do in the French case? So in the French case, again, they're trying to bring about the social republic. And the provisional government in the 1848 revolution has a minister of labor, Louis Blanc, who was a utopian socialist. And they try to institute, as a measure against the mass unemployment of the worldwide Great Depression of the 1840s, what they call the national workshops. So if private capital can't employ people, then the government will employ people instead and do public works projects. So we tend to associate this with the New Deal in the United States in the 1930s, but in fact this already happened in 1848, in the French Revolution of 1848. But they realized they can't finance it because they can't raise the international loans required to finance it or the domestic taxes required to finance it, so they cancel. They cancel the national workshops in the middle of 1848. The revolution breaks out in February of 1848. And then in June of 1848, they cancel the national workshops and the workers rise up against the cancellation of the national workshops and are massacred and deported en masse to the colonies. It's a very brutal suppression of the revolution that took place in France. There's more to the story, but we'll get to that later. So a lot of what we would consider to be socialism today, namely public works projects, infrastructure projects, public welfare projects, government measures to guarantee a decent level of subsistence for the working class. All of that is on the agenda in the 1848 revolutions, and especially in France. And socialists are participating. Proudhon, after first dismissing the revolution as a merely political phenomenon, eventually gets on board with the revolution, and he becomes a delegate in the National Assembly. He's elected to the National Assembly, Proudhon, on the basis of a working class constituency voting for him. All right, so all of that is what is on the horizon when Marx and Engels write the Communist Manifesto. So they're dealing with the socialist and communist movement of the time that had developed for several decades already after the French Revolution in the 1820s and 1830s, and matured in a particular way, had taken a specific direction in the 1840s, exemplified by people like Proudhon, but also other people like Louis Blanc. Louis Blanc, by the way, the Minister of Labor in the Provisional Government in the French Revolution, he coined the phrase, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And also the principle of the freedom of each being the precondition for the freedom of all. So these are phrases that Marx and Engels use in the Communist Manifesto. They're not original to Marx and Engels. They're not original to Marx and Engels. They're part of the general socialist and communist set of demands. And after all, they're writing the manifesto on behalf of the Communist League, which is an organization that is international in character. It has members who are British, French, German, Italian, etc. So, again, Marx and Engels didn't invent socialism and communism, and they put their own twist on it in the manifesto. They put their own twist on it, and we have to pay attention to that twist. So there are three phrases in the manifesto that are key to understanding the peculiar twist of Marxism that Marx and Engels are putting on the more general socialist and communist demands of the time. The first is, history is the history of class struggle. So history is the history of class struggle. This is a peculiar way of interpreting history in a Hegelian sense, meaning what Hegel called what is eternally present in the past. What is eternally present in the past. Meaning that when looking back at the past in a philosophical, historical way, one sees the antecedents, the roots, the sources, the origins of today's struggles. So the idea is that one sees the past in terms of what one is struggling for today. So history is the history of class struggle because the present is a present of class struggle. It's a very peculiar kind of Hegelian thing that Marx and Engels are doing that's usually lost on people. It's usually turned into an economic interpretation of history or a class analysis of history. That's not what it is. What it is all of history has led to this moment, and this moment is a moment of class struggle. Now, why is that? Because actually, the class struggle between the workers and the capitalists is different than the caste struggles of peasants versus lords, or of slaves versus free men. The other thing that's interesting about the class struggles of the past is that they never produced anything, meaning peasant revolts against the lords never overthrew feudalism. Slave revolts against the freemen or the citizens of classical antiquity. Plebeian revolts against patrician rule in ancient Rome did not ever change the system. It never transformed society. It certainly didn't transform the mode of production. That's not how it happened. And yet, Marx and Engels expect the class struggle of their time, the workers versus the capitalists, to lead to the transformation of society and the transformation of the mode of production, from capitalism to communism. So it's a very peculiar thing. So history is the history of class struggle. First phrase. Second phrase, all that is solid melts into air. All that is solid melts into air. Meaning capitalism is not a state of being, but a process of becoming. Capitalism is not a status quo. It's not a static situation. It's a constant revolution. Capitalism as a mode of production depends on constantly revolutionizing the mode of production. It's a peculiar form of society that requires the constant change of society. All that is solid melts into air. So capitalism is revolutionary, and we'll see what he does with this. Capitalism is revolutionary, and that's not only the solution, it's the problem. The problem is the way capitalism is revolutionary. And then finally, workers of the world unite. So they have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Workers of the world unite. Meaning, class struggle is not a local, national thing. It's a world historical thing. It's a cosmopolitan thing. It's a universal thing. It's not a particular thing. Now, this gets to a strange idea, which is the proletarianized working class, or the proletariat as a universal class. For Marx and Engels, the bourgeoisie were also a universal class. What does that mean? Bourgeoisie meaning what? The third estate, the modern third estate in bourgeois society, meaning what would encompass both the workers and the capitalists, meaning the artisans and the merchants, the proprietors and the wage earners. They're all part of the bourgeoisie. They're all town folk, as opposed to the country folk, the peasants, the lords, the country parish priests. The artisans in the village. Those are the country folk. The town folk are the third estate, but as transformed in bourgeois society. Transformed from the social relations of traditional subsistence agriculture to the social relations of labor in exchange. Labor as a commodity production. So that universal character of the bourgeoisie, of the town folk, in transforming society and transforming the world through the bourgeois colonial era, through the unification of the world, Columbian discovery and contact. Right, that cosmopolitan point of view that Kant mentioned, that had been achieved in practice, that gives rise to the idea of a universal history. That is the bourgeoisie is a universal class, but now in capitalism and industrial production, the alienated labor of the proletarianized working class is a new universal condition. Universal condition of need for revolution. So in this respect, they are a universal class in the way that the third estate of bourgeois society was a universal class. Meaning it's meant to totally overthrow the existing state of affairs and produce a new society. All right, so those three concepts. Now, along the way, he and Engels have a critique of existing socialism. They call it existing socialist literature. So they approach it at the level of ideas, theories, but also of demands and programs, of a kind of worldview of various kinds of socialists. And they go through and talk about romantic socialism, reactionary socialism, feudal socialism, Christian socialism, bourgeois socialism. right? The various forms of preceding kinds of socialism. The critique of those is very central to their argument. But also a dialectical approach to capitalism is central to their argument. And that's the part that has a kind of call and response structure, where Marx and Engels take up accusations against communism. So there's finally another phrase, maybe a fourth phrase from the Manifesto we have to keep in mind. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. The very first line. The preamble, as opposed to the beginning of bourgeois and proletarians, history is the history of class struggle. The preamble, specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. The political crisis of bourgeois society and capitalism is creating the specter of communism. How to understand that specter of communism? So, the idea is they're going to take up all the accusations against communism and respond. So what are the things that communism is accused of that they respond to? Communists are accused of wanting to abolish religion. They respond, but capitalism is already abolishing religion. Not only bourgeois society, but specifically capitalism is abolishing religion. Communists want to abolish the family. Marx and Engels respond, actually it's capitalism itself that's already abolishing the family and replacing the sentimental relations of people in the family with the cash nexus. Meaning, what are spouses to each other, what are parents to children, what are children to parents, basically a monetary function. So capitalism is already abolishing the family, it's already abolishing religion. Communists want to abolish private property. Marx and Engels say, capitalism is already abolishing private property. How? It's abolishing private property because it's abolishing the basis of private property, namely labor. So the Lockean basis, the John Locke basis of private property, labor, is being abolished in industrial capitalism, and with it, private property is being abolished. So two kinds of property are abolished in capitalism. Capital itself is abolished through these commercial crises and financial crises, the boom-bust cycle, that is not merely a market cycle, a market correction, but the expression of a societal contradiction, a contradiction of the social relations. Capital abolishes itself. It abolishes itself abstractly and concretely. It abolishes both labor and capital. It abolishes the working class by putting it out of work, by making it unemployed. And it abolishes capitalist industry by driving companies out of business and making factories stand idle. So, communism is the real movement of history because it's the movement of history in capitalism for capitalism to abolish itself. If you recall from the letter to Ruga, for the ruthless criticism of everything existing, for humanity to free itself, it only has to confess its sins for what they really are. Communism is the real movement of history in capitalism, meaning communism will be the realization of what capitalism is already doing, namely abolishing itself. Again, Marx and Engels think that industrial production is leading directly to communism. That's how they imagine things going. They think that they're on the eve of a revolution, and that revolution is going to go directly to communism. And they lay out in their 10-point program of demands how that will come about. meaning how they expect a democratic revolution to face and engage with the problem of capitalism and the measures that will be presented as necessary to take, and that the communists will advocate taking them. Which now seem a little bit like more reform demands of capitalism, many of which have already been achieved. Like a progressive tax rate, public works projects, a minimum wage, these kinds of things. Interestingly, though, Marx and Engels say that these demands don't make any sense at an economic level. They won't work at an economic level. They don't make sense and they won't work at an economic level. Like, trying to implement these things won't actually work. So what's the point of pursuing these demands and implementing them in order to fully manifest the contradiction of capitalism? Meaning these demands will point beyond themselves because they will be impossible to realize. They don't make sense at an economic level. So it's very different from today's, like, quote-unquote socialist or social democratic perspectives, where these demands are seen as ways of fixing capitalism. Marx and Engels see them as impossible to realize. They don't actually make sense economically. They're political demands that point to the overcoming of the whole system, rather than fixing it. So insofar as these demands have been realized in later capitalism, they actually haven't been realized, because they've served an entirely different purpose, which is to fix capitalism, meaning to kind of forestall its crisis, to try to mitigate its contradiction, rather than, as Marx and Engels saw these demands, as leading to manifesting the necessity of overthrowing capitalism as a whole. All right, so that's what I had to say about the manifesto. So let me turn to you guys' notes on it. I'll share my screen and ask you guys to take us through your notes. Start with Haley.
Okay, mine are a bit all over the place, so I did the coming upheaval like under. You scroll down a little bit. Yeah, sorry, I only had one thing for that, but I included that quote because I feel like it still holds up today. Like, a lot of people try to divorce social movements from political movements, but they doesn't really work that way. And then for the manifesto, I have the opening line, which I kind of just, what you said basically summed it up. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The specter still kind of exists today. Like, even though it's not something that, communists aren't it's not like a super popular ideology in America. Like, there's a very small, like, fringe group of them. People still throw around the term for, like, anyone even left of center. It's like the Red Scare is still kind of going on, even though it technically ended however long ago in, like, the 90s. So
Marx and Engels talk about how every demand for reform is labeled by political opponents as communism. So everyone's accusing each other of communism in the dominant system, and that's happening today.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So it was like, it's like the boogeyman, which is, I guess, like the specter in a way. And then I had this quote about how the bourgeois is like, it can be interchangeable with like urbanites, right? That bourgeois society relies on rural society and like farmers and stuff like that. And it reminded me of this book I read called Blockchain Chicken Farm, which is about the emerging tech stuff going on in rural China, and how a lot of the super high tech stuff going on in China is like heavily relies on rural communities, and a lot of people from cities kind of, I mean, not all, I mean, in general, people kind of view rural people as backwards. I'm sorry, I'm getting off track.
No, that's
but
right.
The book is just basically about like the urban and rural dynamic and how it's all kind of symbiotic. And I just...
Yeah, how capitalism has subjected agriculture to itself.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's proletarianized agricultural labor as much as it's proletarianized urban labor.
Yeah, exactly. So I recommend that book if you're into like how, like, just the dynamic between those two things, especially in China, where it's kind of like an extreme version. Like, they're super high tech and their agriculture is huge. So that was a really interesting read. But that's what that reminded me of. And then I had this quote. I was going to ask you to help demystify it because it's very verbose. I think I get it, but it reminded me of how politicians kind of like play
with words,
pay lip service.
Oh yeah. There's rhetoric with Marx and Engels. This is so. In this way, feudal socialism, half lamentation, half lampoon, half echo of the past, half menace of the future, at times by its bitter, witty, and incisive criticism, striking the bourgeoisie to the very heart's core, but always ludicrous in its effect, through total incapacity to comprehend the march of modern history, the aristocracy, in order to rally the people to them, waved the proletarian alms bag in front for a banner. But the people, so often as it joined them, saw in their hindquarters the old feudal coat of arms and deserted with loud and irreverent laughter. Meaning there is a conservative reactionary opposition to capitalism. There is. And that's what he means by feudal socialism. So a kind of noblesse oblige, right? So the idea that the aristocracy has a Christian duty to take care of the poor. So that kind of version of socialism, which is still a lot of what is going on with socialism and communism today. Like, insofar as socialism and communism is popular, it's usually among rich people who basically have a philanthropic attitude towards poor people.
That's what it reminded me of, the it's kind of like a pejorative, but champagne socialists, like the idea
Champagne socialists.
Yeah, it reminded me of that.
Absolutely. The champagne socialists. What was it that Marco Rubio said? He said limousine liberals and lunatic Marxists.
Yeah.
Right?
The big Trump spiel, too. I forget what he said, but...
I think so. About Zoran Mamdani.
Radical left lunatics and the...
Oh, yeah, radical left lunatics.
That, too, yeah.
Right. That's right. So we have this. It's still going on. It's funny how this works. So the specter is still there, but also a kind of reactionary anti-capitalism. And by reactionary, not reactive, but reactionary in the sense of what people meant by the reaction, meaning the people who wanted to turn back the clock on the French Revolution, who wanted to restore what the French Revolution had overthrown, which they did, but they couldn't actually really do that. They couldn't really undo history. And that's Marx's point here, that capitalism does generate a kind of romantic anti-capitalism, a kind of nostalgia for the past.
Right. That helps. Thank you.
Yes. Cool. Okay. Indy, did you want to take us through your notes?
Sure. I thought it was interesting how he talks about the development of how bourgeois society has gotten to be the way it is, and it's it itself is a product of a ton of development over time. But it also has stripped every other occupation of its, like, I don't know, what it used to be, and where it's now just, it's a job.
Yes.
You get paid for your time rather than for your skill.
Right.
Or, like, the training that you put into it.
Right.
At least that's what the first quote I was really getting into with that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second one is a lot more of, like, society finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism because of too much civilization.
Mm-hmm.
I found that really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I have any questions about it, as much as I thought it was, like, yeah, it makes sense, but it's also weird to see, like, how this is how everything is built up.
Mm-hmm. Comes to a kind of destructive point.
Yeah.
So,
and with capitalism, like, how, like, the only way to get rid of it is to either destroy it or make even more of it.
yes. That's a very important point, actually. So, in certain respects, Marx and Engels want to see capitalism completed. Like, they don't want to turn back the clock on capitalism. They want to see it fulfilled, completed, fully realized. And yet, that itself is a kind of paradoxical proposition. Meaning that capitalism seems to destroy everything without replacing it with something better. So it seems to destroy everything and leave us with something worse than what we had before. By the way, this is how he described British colonialism in India. He said, he called it the melancholy of the Hindu, namely that British colonialism had destroyed the traditional society without replacing it with something better. So he is emphasizing the destructive aspect, or we might say the negative aspect. Again, that the proletariat is a kind of negative phenomenon of this destructive quality of capitalism. But the only way out is through, to use a kind of self-help formulation, like the only way out is through, meaning you can't turn back the clock on it. There's no way around it. So there is only a path leading through it. It's a very peculiar idea that, again, the proletariat, the proletarianized working class, the working class that has been completely debased by capitalism, so the old artisanal status of the worker has been completely liquidated. It's only in and through that communism can be achieved. And by communism is meant actually a qualitative transformation of capitalism. Because otherwise, communism can look like just the completion of the negation inherent in capitalism. And by the way, in the 1844 manuscripts, this idea of abolishing private property and turning the state into the capitalist over all members of society, many people have read that as anticipating what happened in the Soviet Union and Communist China and the East Bloc more generally in the 20th century. That what you got was not a qualitative transformation, a new society, freedom. What you got instead was a kind of very mean version of capitalism. You got state capitalism. So instead of private capitalism, you got state capitalism. Now the paradox there are two things to say about that. One is that, of course, the Russian Empire at the time of the Russian Revolution, China at the time of the Chinese Revolution, these were peasant societies that needed to build up industry. They needed to proletarianize their labor force. And so, in many respects, they had a capitalist project. They had a project of capital accumulation. And indeed, Communist China took that path explicitly in the 1980s under Deng Xiaoping. That you're going to have a capitalist road to socialism. You're going to have a capitalist path of socialist construction, which in many ways would seem to be in keeping with Marx and Engels' original perspective. However, what Marx and Engels expected was the development of communism on the basis of the highest achievement of capitalism. The highest achievement of capitalism technologically, but also the highest achievement of capitalism in terms of this negative principle, meaning a situation in which the bourgeois value of labor, the bourgeois social relations of labor, were fully realized but also fully contradicted, fully negated in capitalism, in a way that could not have been the case in Russia or China. Right, so because they were fulfilling a different task locally in terms of changing a peasant country into an industrial country. So what he calls momentary barbarism seems to have been realized on a kind of horrific mass scale in the communist East of the 20th century. It seems to be like capitalism, but worse. So all the destruction and dislocation of the Industrial Revolution, but in concentrated form, in brutal form, and politically in a kind of barbaric form, because it's being implemented by the state, rather than happening spontaneously through historical development, as capitalism had emerged spontaneously out of bourgeois society in the Industrial Revolution. So, looked at from the standpoint of 2025, a lot of what Marx and Engels were writing in the 1840s resonates. However, we also have this history standing between now and then, and that's the history of actually existing socialism or actually existing communism with the communist states, the revolutions of the 20th century, and the communism that resulted from them. Not what Marx and Engels anticipated. Not at all what they anticipated. And in some ways fulfilling what they critiqued about both capitalism and socialist and communist ideology in their own time. Okay, we're getting short on time. Let me turn quickly to the last reading that we did. And that was the Class Struggle and Mode of Production, which was... Here, let me go to the table of contents. Okay, so here's Marx writing later, so this is in the aftermath of the 1848 revolutions, the failure of the 1848 revolutions, writing to his publisher and editor, Joseph Wedemeyer, who was publishing a book that Marx wrote that we're not reading in this class, but a very important book by Marx called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And really there, Marx develops a kind of view of the political situation that goes beyond what he and Engels had written in the Communist Manifesto. So there they said, communists do not form a party separate from other parties, but only form the left wing or the radical edge of the Democratic Party, the small d Democratic Party. What would he mean by that? Basically, the communists participate in the Democratic Revolution and push it to communism. They changed their mind about this because they saw the necessity of the working class organizing independently and forming a party of its own, and aspiring to a different goal than just a radical democratic revolution. So let's see how he describes it here. He says, as to myself, no credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle between them. Long before me, bourgeois historians had described the historical development of this class struggle, and bourgeois economists an economic anatomy of the classes. What I did that was new was to prove, 1, that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production. Namely, only industrial capitalism produces this capitalist versus worker or bourgeois versus proletariat division. 2, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. So the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And 3, that this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes into a classless society. Meaning the dictatorship of the proletariat is not communism, but is only a transition to communism. And in many respects, this is the most controversial aspect of Marxism. It's the unique aspect of Marxism at a political level, meaning what distinguishes Marx and Engels from other socialists and communists is this idea that they have, this prognosis that they have, of the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that that itself won't be socialism or communism, that itself will only be a transition. And we'll address that later in subsequent readings, but the idea is that the dictatorship of the proletariat is actually the final stage of capitalism. So the dictatorship of the proletariat will be the working class taking political power to administer capitalism. And then capitalism will be transformed into socialism or communism. But the working class revolting, making a revolution, a proletarian socialist revolution, will not itself abolish capitalism, but will only be the beginning of, will only open the door to the abolition of capitalism. That's the controversial point, because of course most socialists and communists, like anarchists, they want to go immediately to communism. They don't see the point of a major political upheaval if all it's going to do is bring us to our final stage of capitalism and not yet overthrow it. But Marx and Engels had reasons for thinking that, for expecting this to be the case. And not only because of the failure of the revolutions of 1848, but because of the way they understood capitalism itself. Again, that communism is the real movement of history, meaning communism is the real movement of history within capitalism, and that the proletariat represents a negative principle, not a positive principle. So communism isn't about making the entire world proletarian. It's not. If that is a phase to be anticipated, making the entire world proletarian, that would be the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that would be political, because in some ways capitalism itself is already proletarianizing the world. It's already making everyone into the proletariat. Objectively. But then subjectively, the political act will be the dictatorship of the proletariat, but that in and of itself will not be communism. That will only be capitalism raised to a subjective political phenomenon, whereas now it remains an objective economic phenomenon. So it goes back to what he wrote in The Coming Upheaval in 1847, the class in itself and the class for itself, and the class abolishing itself. All right. Okay, so we've reached time. So let's continue this discussion on Monday. We'll now get into the details of how Marx understood the contradiction of capitalism, and how it points beyond itself. So the immanent dialectical critique of political economy is going to continue in the Grundrisse and Das Kapital. And the critique of socialism is going to continue there as well. We'll see. All right. Have a good night, everyone. Have a good weekend. Take good care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Bye, guys.